The wind whispered through the golden trees of the elite Maple Crest neighborhood, sweeping crisp autumn leaves across glistening stone driveways. Among the grandeur of mansions and manicured lawns, two small boys walked hand in hand, an image out of place, fragile in the heart of luxury. 7-year-old twins Elijah and Evan Carter trudged quietly, their shoes thin and worn, their jackets barely enough to fight the chill in the air. Their eyes brilliant sky blue and wide with worry scan each house they passed. "You sure this is okay?" Evan whispered, his grip on Elijah's hand tightening. Elijah gave a firm nod. Though they were the same age, he had always taken the lead. "We have to have. Mom hasn't eaten in 3 days. She gave us her last bread crust yesterday." Their mother, Rachel Carter, had grown pale and weak, refusing food so they could eat. The image of her sunken cheeks and trembling hands haunted them. Elijah stopped in front of the grandest house they'd seen. Tall wrought iron gates stood half open, leading to a sprawling estate bathed in amber light. "This one," he said quietly. Inside the mansion, Julian Westwood, a 43-year-old real estate mogul, sat in a dimly lit study. A glass of aged scotch rested untouched beside him. The room was silent, no laughter, no footsteps, no echoes of life. It had been that way for 2 years since he lost his beloved wife, Lena. Despite the wealth he'd amassed, Julian had never felt poorer in spirit. The nursery upstairs remained sealed like a tomb, a tribute to a child they'd never had, a life that never began. Then, the doorbell rang. "Sir," said Alfred, his faithful butler of nearly 2 decades, appearing in the doorway. "There are children at the door." Julian frowned. "Children?" He rose from his chair, curiosity nudging him forward. As he opened the massive front doors, time seemed to freeze. 2 little boys stood before him, shivering, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes wide with something between hope and fear. "Excuse me, sir," the taller one said, his voice soft but steady. "Could you spare any food? Our mom is really sick. We haven't eaten since yesterday." Julian's breath caught. The resemblance was immediate. The same intense blue eyes, the same chin. The way the elder boy stood protectively in front of his brother, like a young knight without armor. He blinked, his voice oddly distant to his own ears. "Of course, come in." As the boys stepped inside the mansion, Alfred glanced at Julian, stunned. His employer, who hadn't let anyone cross the threshold in years, was now welcoming 2 ragged children into his home without hesitation. Julian didn't understand it either, but something inside him, something long buried, stirred awake. The cold in his heart began to melt. Julian Westwood's estate was a masterpiece of old-world elegance, hand-carved mahogany railings, marble floors that gleamed under golden chandeliers, and paintings worth more than most houses. But as Elijah and Evan followed Julian through the vast entrance hall, the sound of their small footsteps echoed not just against the walls, but in the hollow silence that had ruled this house for years. "Alfred," Julian called over his shoulder, "ask Mrs. Delaney to prepare something warm for our young guests." "Yes, sir," the butler replied, still wearing a look of disbelief. Julian led the twins into the sitting room, where a fireplace crackled beneath an ornate mantel. The boys perched stiffly on the edge of a velvet settee, their wide eyes scanning the towering bookshelves and polished surfaces. "This place is huge," Elijah whispered, staring up at the high ceiling. "Like a palace," Evan added in awe. Julian gave a small, unexpected smile. "Feels too big most days." He wasn't sure why he'd said that. It wasn't something he admitted, not to Alfred, not to Mrs. Delaney, not even to himself. But these boys, strangers not even an hour ago, stirred something familiar in him, something real. "Do you live here all alone?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julian nodded. "Just me and the staff. My wife." He paused. "She passed away a couple of years ago. Our grandma died last year," Elijah said softly. "Mom says she's still watching over us." Julian studied their faces again, the tilt of their chins, the shape of their eyebrows. It was uncanny, like looking at himself at that age. "You mentioned your mother is ill," Julian said gently. Elijah's face grew serious. "She used to work all the time, but then she got really sick. She says she's fine, but she's not. She gave us her food for 3 days," Evan added, his voice thick. "Said she wasn't hungry, but we knew." Something twisted in Julian's chest, not just sympathy, but a feeling far more primal, a protective instinct. At that moment, Alfred returned. "Dinner will be ready shortly, sir." Julian nodded. then followed him into the hallway, speaking low. "Did you notice?" "Yes, sir," Alfred replied quietly. "The resemblance is striking." Julian glanced back through the doorway. Elijah was standing guard near the fireplace while Evan carefully examined a chess set on a nearby table. It was a scene that should have been impossible, but somehow, it felt like it had been waiting to happen all along. A quiet voice inside him whispered the unthinkable. Could they be mine? The formal dining room had never felt more alive. Mrs. Delaney, the warm-hearted housekeeper, had prepared a modest but inviting spread: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, buttered rolls, and steamed vegetables. The boys' eyes widened at the sight, but they waited for permission. "Please, eat as much as you'd like," Julian encouraged gently. Despite their obvious hunger, Elijah and Evan used their utensils properly, unfolded their napkins, and chewed quietly, carefully. Julian watched in astonishment. "Your mother taught you good manners," Elijah nodded proudly. "She says manners don't cost anything, so even if we don't have much, we can still have those. She used to work in an office before we were born," Evan added between bites. "She knows which forks go where." Julian's hand froze. Midair. "Office?" He composed himself. "Where does she work now?" "Lots of places," Elijah replied. "She stocks shelves at the grocery store, cleans houses sometimes, and she answers phones at night. She went to college though," Evan said. "She has a diploma on the wall." Julian's heart began to pound, a slow, thunderous rhythm in his ears. He forced his tone to stay casual. "What's your mother's name?" "Rachel Carter," Elijah answered, his fork pausing in midair. The name hit Julian like a jolt to the chest. Rachel Carter. Not just a memory, a name once etched into his daily life. His former secretary at Westwood Realty. Brilliant, soft-spoken, fiercely independent. They'd shared a brief relationship nearly 7 years ago before he met Lena. The twins were 6. The math was exact. His gaze snapped back to their faces. The blue eyes, the chin, the quiet strength Elijah carried. Evan's observant nature. Not coincidence, not chance, truth. The pieces clicked together in a single, staggering moment. Julian excused himself, rising slowly from the table. In the hallway, he steadied himself against the wall, breath ragged, eyes clouded with disbelief. Those boys, they were his dot in the grand kitchen, gleaming with polished marble and brushed gold fixtures. Elijah and Evan sat at the breakfast nook, their small hands folded in their laps as Mrs. Delaney pulled a steaming apple pie from the warming oven. "Would you boys like some dessert?" she asked gently. Elijah glanced at Evan, silently seeking his brother's comfort and cue. Evan nodded, then remembered his manners. "Yes, please, ma'am," he said softly. Julian stood near the doorway, watching them, not as a stranger anymore, but with the silent awe of someone witnessing something that mattered. The way Elijah subtly shifted his chair closer to his brother, the quiet calm with which Evan waited, it reminded him of his own childhood with his younger brother who passed too soon. Their dignity, despite the hunger, was something that tugged deep inside his chest. "Your mother must be worried about you," Julian said as he joined them at the table. Mrs. Delaney served generous slices of pie, each topped with vanilla ice cream. "We left a note," Elijah said quietly, his eyes focused on the curling steam. "We told her we were getting help. She's been really sick," Evan added, his voice almost a whisper. "Yesterday she couldn't even stand up. She said she'd be fine tomorrow, but she says that every day." Julian exchanged a concerned glance with Mrs. Delaney. Something in their tone, the calm acceptance of crisis, was more devastating than any cry for help. "What happened to your home?" he asked, trying to sound gentle. The boys hesitated. "We still have it," Elijah said finally, "but the heat got shut off last week. Mom wrapped us up in all the blankets. There's no food left either," Evan added. "A neighbor brought soup 2 days ago, but that's gone now." Julian's fists clenched beneath the table. His mind reeled with images of the boys curled under blankets in a cold apartment while he slept in silk sheets, surrounded by opulence and silence. "No child should go through this," he murmured. As the boys finished their dessert, Julian stood. "When you're done," he said, trying to steady his voice, "I'll take you home with some food for your mother." Evan's face lit up with cautious hope. "Really? I'll pack plenty," Mrs. Delaney assured, already heading toward the pantry. Julian nodded, but in his heart, the decision was already larger than dinner. These boys weren't leaving his life, not again. As they walked toward the garage, Julian's thoughts raced. 7 years of fatherhood lost. 7 years he could never reclaim. But he could start now. Whatever mistakes had been made, whatever had separated them, he would not let these children disappear into the cold again. Not these boys. Not his sons. Julian Westwood lay in the darkness of his master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, his mind a torrent of images, the boys' faces, their voices, their stories, and the name Rachel Carter. The sheets beneath him were Egyptian cotton, the mattress custom made for comfort, but he felt no rest, no peace. Only a churning storm inside his chest. By 3 o'clock a.m., sleep had abandoned him entirely. He rose, padded barefoot down the hall, and entered his home office, a place of order, precision, and control. It was where he'd signed billion-dollar deals and architected an empire. But tonight, he was there for something far more personal. He unlocked a tall, narrow filing cabinet tucked behind the door. His hands moved automatically, stopping at a worn tab labeled Carter, Rachel K. He slid the file free. Inside, glowing performance reviews, contact sheets, and a small sealed envelope. He had never opened it. It was her resignation letter, dated 7 years ago. With hesitant fingers, he tore it open. Julian, I am resigning effective immediately due to personal reasons. I appreciate the opportunity to have worked for Westwood Realty. Rachel Carter. That was it. No explanation. No forwarding address. And no mention of a pregnancy. He sank into the leather chair, stunned. Their brief relationship had been intense but private. It had ended just before he met Lena, a whirlwind romance that consumed everything after. Had Rachel tried to tell him? Had she already known? He opened his laptop, searching desperately. Social media yielded nothing current, no trace of a Rachel Carter in the local area. He dug deeper: public records, employment history. Then he found it. Rachel K. Carter, residing in the Eastview district, one of the poorest sections of the city. She worked multiple part-time jobs. No marriage license. No partner listed. Julian leaned back, staring at the screen, breath heavy. While he had been donating millions to charitable foundations, his own children had been going to bed hungry. The guilt hit like a landslide. He had been living in silent grief for the family he thought he lost, while another had existed just across town, struggling to survive. Suddenly, a soft knock at the office door broke the silence. Alfred stood there, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Sir, he said gently, the boys are back. Julian stood at once. In the front foyer, Elijah and Evan stood side by side, their cheeks flushed from the morning cold, clutching a small basket between them. Mom ate some soup and toast, Elijah reported seriously. She told us not to bother you. But we just wanted to say thank you. Julian knelt before them, his voice barely steady. You're not bothering me. I'm glad your mother ate. Is she any better? She's still coughing a lot, Evan said, eyes downcast. Her forehead was really hot. Julian looked from one to the other, these small boys with brave hearts, doing all they could. He rose with purpose. I have a friend. He's a doctor, he said. Would you let him visit your mother? As a favor to me? The twins hesitated. We don't have money for doctors, Elijah said quietly. And Mom says hospitals ask too many questions. This won't cost a thing, Julian promised. No questions. Just someone to help her feel better. Elijah glanced at Evan. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, Elijah nodded. Julian picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. An hour later, the quiet of a modest third-floor apartment in Eastview was broken by the sound of careful footsteps. Dr. Harris, a kind-eyed physician in his early 60s, stepped out of a dimly lit bedroom with a grim look on his face. Julian stood in the cramped living room, tension visible in his jaw. The twins, Elijah and Evan, sat close together on a faded sofa, trying to stay strong. She has severe pneumonia, Dr. Harris said quietly. Her lungs are compromised. She's running a dangerously high fever and her oxygen levels are low. She needs immediate hospitalization. Julian's heart sank. I'll make the arrangements, he said without hesitation. Private hospital, best room, whatever she needs. Dr. Harris gave a respectful nod and made the call. As the ambulance was dispatched, Julian observed the twins as they moved through the apartment. With solemn efficiency, they packed a few of their mother's belongings: a robe, a hairbrush, her slippers. There were no toys in sight, no extra coats, no signs of a child's carefree life, just survival. Julian's throat tightened. These children had learned to carry burdens far too heavy for their years. I'll ride with her, Dr. Harris offered. Julian turned to Elijah and Evan. You'll come with me, he said gently. You can follow the ambulance to the hospital in my car. They nodded, too tired to argue. As they drove through the city, the boys sat in the back seat, gazing quietly out the windows. Julian glanced at them through the rearview mirror, guilt and awe twisting inside him. He had spent the last 7 years sleeping in silk sheets while these two had learned how to warm soup, fold laundry, and stay quiet when their mother was too sick to move. That kind of resilience was not taught. It was forged. By the time they arrived at Westbrook Memorial's private wing, the ambulance had already reached. Nurses and staff moved quickly to transfer Rachel Carter into a clean, heated room. Julian stayed by the boy's side as they watched her being wheeled away, her hand still curled weakly around the corner of a blanket. I want to stay with her, Evan whispered. You'll see her as soon as the doctors finish, Julian reassured him. She's in good hands now. The twins leaned into each other, exhaustion finally overtaking the tension they'd been carrying. Julian knelt between them, placing a hand on each small shoulder. Listen, he said quietly, whatever happens from this point forward, I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone anymore. Neither child spoke, but the way they didn't pull away spoke volumes. As nurses moved around them, Julian stood there, silently watching over them, and somewhere deep inside him, a vow formed, unshakable, unwavering. He would never let them fall through the cracks again. The tires of a sleek black Bentley shrieked slightly as it curved into the stone driveway of the Westwood estate. Gravel scattered beneath it like sparks under pressure. Inside, Victor Langford, Julian's longtime attorney and closest confidant, stepped out, suit crisp, jaw locked. At 62, his silver hair matched his temperament, sharp, calculating, and always in control. He didn't wait for an invitation. Where is he? Victor barked at Alfred, who opened the door without flinching. Mr. Westwood is on the rear terrace, sir, the butler replied evenly. Shall I announce? Don't bother. Victor marched through the house as if it were his own, which in many ways it had been. He'd helped Julian navigate lawsuits, acquisitions, mergers, and now this. He stepped onto the terrace and froze. There, beneath the morning sun, Julian Westwood sat calmly in a wicker chair, watching two boys, Elijah and Evan, giggling. As they played a makeshift game of tag around the garden fountain, Victor's expression darkened. Have you completely lost your mind? He hissed as he strode forward. Julian didn't even turn. I was wondering when you'd show up. Alfred called me in a panic, Victor snapped. Said you took in a pair of street kids and rushed a woman to the hospital. The media's already sniffing. This is a disaster. They're not street kids, Julian said quietly, still watching the boys. They're my sons. Victor's mouth opened and closed like a man sucker punched. You're serious? Julian finally stood, calm, grounded, unshaken. Victor dragged him inside, into the study, away from the boys. He closed the doors behind them and spun around. Julian, this has scam written all over it. Some woman shows up with two lookalike kids, and you just believe her? No test? No legal counsel? You of all people just let them in? Rachel hasn't claimed anything, Julian said sharply. She doesn't even know I suspect the truth, Victor scoffed. You can't be sure. Children can be made to look like anyone. Makeup, coaching, suggestion. And if this becomes public, you're opening the gates to every so-called long-lost child with a sob story. Julian's jaw flexed. They showed up at my door asking for food. That's it. No demands. No story. Yet, Victor shot back. That's how it starts. First sympathy, then DNA tests, then court claims and media leaks. You're skipping straight to moving them in? They have nowhere else to go, Julian said, his voice low. Their mother is in a hospital bed, with pneumonia. What do you suggest? I send them into foster care while I consult my legal team? Victor stepped closer, voice dropping to a cold whisper. Think about your reputation, your company, your shareholders. When this hits the press, and it won't just be about secret children. It'll be about betrayal, scandal, a real estate tycoon with illegitimate twins and a former secretary hidden away in Eastview. Julian's eyes narrowed. Don't, he said, deadly quiet. Don't turn this into a PR checklist. Victor leaned in. Then tell me one thing, Julian. If Rachel Carter is who you think she is, why didn't she ever tell you? Julian looked away for the first time. I don't know, he whispered. A T. Westbrook Memorial Hospital. Rachel Carter stirred in her hospital bed, the beeping of monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic surrounding her like a prison. The oxygen mask on her face made breathing easier, but her mind was anything but calm. She drifted in and out of sleep, fighting the fever that clouded her thoughts. Then a nurse leaned over gently. "Your boys are safe, honey," she whispered. "A Mr. Westwood has been looking after them while you recover." Rachel's eyes snapped open. She tried to sit up, but a coughing fit rattled through her body like an earthquake. The name Westwood echoed in her head like an alarm. "Did you say Westwood?" she gasped between coughs. The nurse nodded. "Julian Westwood. He said he's a family friend." Rachel shook her head furiously, the monitor beside her spiking. No, he can't. He can't have my boys. Miss Carter, please relax, you don't understand," she cried, clutching the nurse's sleeve. "He didn't want them before. He doesn't get them now." The nurse eased her gently back onto the pillow, speaking softly. "Whatever it is, you can sort it out when you're stronger." But Rachel's tears had already begun to fall. For 6 long years, she had built a wall between her boys and the man who had chosen career over fatherhood. At least that's what she'd been told. She had protected Elijah and Evan not just from poverty, but from the pain of rejection. She had never told them the truth, never told them their father had known about them and chosen money instead of them, that Julian Westwood had sent a check. And now, through some cruel twist of fate, her boys, her precious sons, were in the very arms she'd tried to shield them from. Sleeping under the roof of a man who once, in her darkest hour, had turned his back on her. She turned her face to the wall, hot tears soaking the pillow. Let them have his mansion, she thought bitterly. Let them taste the world that could have been theirs. But when he gets bored, when the novelty wears off, they'll be left behind again, and she won't be there to catch them. Despite Victor's warnings and the storm he knew was coming, Julian Westwood couldn't bring himself to send the boys away. The mansion, once a cathedral of silence and sorrow, had begun to breathe again. Laughter, though quiet and cautious, echoed faintly through the halls. Small footsteps padded across marble floors. Rooms long locked in grief flickered back to life. Mrs. Delaney noticed it first. Lights turned on in places that had remained dark for years. Meals were prepared with joy, not obligation. Fresh sheets were laid on beds meant for children. For the first time since Lena's death, Julian wasn't just existing in the house, he was living. One morning, Julian entered the library and found Evan cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by open books. "What are you reading?" Julian asked, kneeling beside him. Evan looked up shyly. "Stars, black holes. I want to be a scientist. Or maybe an astronaut." Julian smiled, surprised by the warmth rising in his chest. "I wanted to be an astronaut too, when I was your age." "Really?" "I had glow-in-the-dark stars all over my ceiling." Evan's eyes lit up. "Mom wouldn't let us put anything on the walls. Our landlord said it'd peel the paint." Without a word, Julian stood and reached for a heavy astronomy atlas from the top shelf. He handed it to Evan, then almost instinctively lifted the boy onto his shoulders so he could see better. Evan laughed. "Whoa, I can see everything from up here." Meanwhile, across the hall in the study, Elijah had discovered a marble chess set. Julian entered and found him frowning at the board, carefully arranging the pieces. "Do you play?" Julian asked. "No, sir," Elijah replied, "but I've watched people play in the park. I like the horse one." Julian chuckled. "That's a knight. Would you like to learn?" Elijah looked up, eyes brightening. "Yes, please. I'm good at games." As they began playing, Julian watched in admiration as Elijah picked up the game quickly. By the 3rd round, he was already thinking to moves ahead, strategic, focused, patient. "You're a natural," Julian said as Elijah captured his bishop. "You think like a chess player. Mom says I get too competitive," Elijah said with a grin. "Evan lets me win, but I can tell." These small ordinary moments, reading star maps with Evan, playing chess with Elijah, healed something in Julian he hadn't known was broken. Every shared glance, every question, every laugh chipped away at the walls around his heart. Each night, Dr. Harris updated him on Rachel's condition. "She's improving," the doctor said. "But slowly. The infection was severe. She'll need weeks to rebuild her strength." One evening, as Mrs. Delaney helped the twins brush their teeth before bed, Elijah turned to Julian. "Mr. Westwood," he asked carefully, "why are you helping us so much?" Julian paused at the doorway, uncertain how to answer without revealing the truth too soon. He knelt beside them, because, he said slowly, everyone needs help sometimes. And, you two remind me of what's really important. The boys didn't ask anything more, but that night, after they were tucked into bed, Julian remained standing in the hall, staring at the closed door to the nursery, a room that had been silent for 7 years, and now, perhaps, had finally found its purpose. It was late, the kind of stillness only a quiet mansion can hold. The twins had finally fallen asleep, their breathing even, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of the nursery nightlight. Downstairs, in the vast library lit by the low amber flicker of the fireplace, Julian Westwood sat alone, a book open in his lap but untouched. His thoughts, as they had been for days, were on Rachel. When she entered the room, he looked up, surprised. She was thinner now, wrapped in a soft robe, still regaining her strength, but her presence filled the space like it once had all those years ago. Confident, silent, sharp. They have your mannerisms, she said softly, stepping closer. Julian closed the book slowly. So I've noticed. Evan taps his fingers on his leg when he's thinking. Elijah tilts his head when he's planning a move on the chessboard, she added. They didn't learn that from me. There was a long pause. The kind where time feels like it's waiting for the truth to arrive. When did you know? She asked, arms crossed gently over her chest. The second I saw them, Julian replied. It was like looking in a mirror I didn't know existed. Rachel inhaled sharply, her voice tightening. Then why? Why did you disappear? Why act like they never existed for all these years? Julian shook his head, his voice low. I didn't know. Rachel, I swear to you I didn't know. She stared at him, lips pressed into a line. Victor Langford showed up 7 years ago, brought a check and a confidentiality agreement. Said you weren't interested in fatherhood, that you wanted it handled privately, quietly. You didn't even want to see me. Julian's face drained of color. I never sent him. I never even knew. He made it clear, Rachel continued, voice shaking, that if I didn't disappear, if I didn't sign, it would cost you your reputation, your company, that I was a problem to be erased. Julian stood slowly, disbelief washing over him like ice. I never received any letter from you. I thought you left because you didn't want me in your life. I tried, she whispered. I tried to talk to you, but then I saw you in the society pages, with her, with Lena, and I thought, her voice caught, I thought you'd made your choice. Julian's eyes shone under the firelight. I kept your picture. Rachel blinked, startled. It's the only image the boys ever had of you, she said, pulling a worn photograph from her robe pocket. A younger Julian, at a company picnic, smiling into the sun. I told them you were too busy for a family, she added, eyes full of quiet pain. But I never told them you were a bad man. I couldn't bear for them to feel unwanted. Julian took the photo gently from her hand, his thumb brushing over the creased edges. I missed 6 years, he said, voice breaking. 6 birthdays, first words, first steps, all of it. She nodded, her own tears falling freely now. We all did. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by silence and flame, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two people holding the broken halves of the same truth. Neither said another word, but something shifted in that space. Forgiveness, or at least the beginning of it. Sunday morning arrived with a thick silence draped over the Westwood mansion. The air was heavy with something unspoken, waiting to erupt. In the library, Julian paced in front of the fireplace, a sealed envelope in one hand. Rachel's letter from 7 years ago, the same one she said she wrote but he never received. Her handwriting was unmistakable. The envelope had been unopened, hidden, until now. The door opened, and Victor Langford entered with his usual confidence. But something in Julian's expression made him pause mid-step. I came as you asked, Victor said cautiously. What's this about? Julian held up the envelope like evidence in a courtroom. You intercepted this. Victor's brow twitched. That could be any letter. Don't insult my intelligence, Julian snapped. You told Rachel I wanted her and the twins out of my life. You forged a decision I never made. Victor adjusted his tie, carefully measured. Julian, I did what needed to be done. You were about to marry Lena. The company was mid-merger. A scandal, a child isn't a scandal, Julian interrupted, voice sharp. You stole my sons from me. You manipulated a woman into disappearing with my children, and you did it under my name. Victor scoffed, defensive. She was your secretary, Julian. A brief mistake. You had a future to protect. I protected it. Julian stepped forward, eyes burning. You didn't protect me. You protected control. You decided what I could handle. You decided who stayed in my life. Victor's expression darkened. You would have thrown it all away out of guilt. I made the right call. You made the call for me. Julian roared, slamming the letter down onto the desk. They grew up without their father. Rachel worked 3 jobs, got sick from exhaustion, while I sat in this damn mansion thinking I'd lost everything. Victor took a breath, straightened. Look, we can contain this. We draft a clean settlement. You stay quiet about the past, and I help manage the optics. No, Julian said, ice now coating his tone. You're done. Victor blinked. Excuse me? You're fired, effective immediately. And if you come near Rachel or the boys again, I swear, Victor, I will destroy whatever legacy you think you've built. For the first time in years, Victor looked stunned, speechless, and standing in the doorway quietly, unseen. Rachel heard every word. She had come to speak with Julian. Instead, she heard the truth crash down like broken glass, the lies she'd believed, the love she thought had been discarded. Her hand covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. And silently, she slipped away down the hall, not broken this time, but finally beginning to understand. Julian had never turned away from her. He had simply never been given the chance to choose. The morning papers arrived like a bomb at the gates of the Westwood estate. Julian's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as he stared at the front page. Westwood's secret heirs, twin sons from former secretary revealed. Below the headline, a photo of Elijah and Evan playing in the mansion's garden was plastered next to a younger image of Julian from his real estate empire days and a grainy shot of Rachel being wheeled out of the hospital. The article spared no detail. It dug up Rachel's employment history, speculated about Julian's paternity, and quoted an anonymous source close to the Westwood circle. Undoubtedly Victor, still wielding his poison from the shadows. Alfred appeared behind him. Sir? The butler said quietly. There are reporters outside the gates. Moments later, Rachel entered the dining room, pale, clutching her phone. The school called, she said, her voice strained. There are reporters waiting outside, with cameras. The boys are scared, Julian. He was already on the phone. I'll have security bring them home. This ends now. But it didn't. Not yet. By noon, Julian's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Board members, investors, clients, everyone demanding clarity, control, reassurance. But all Julian could think about was Rachel and the boys. Later that evening, after hours of damage control calls, Julian stepped into the guest suite where Rachel had taken refuge. She sat on the bed, her face flushed again, eyes glassy with fatigue. Mrs. Delaney stood nearby with a thermometer. She's running a low-grade fever. Stress won't let her heal. Julian dismissed the housekeeper gently and sat beside Rachel, placing a cool compress on her forehead. I'm sorry, he whispered. Victor's behind this. I know it. Rachel didn't respond at first. She just stared at the ceiling. The boys are confused, she finally murmured. They don't understand why people are shouting questions at them, asking if you're their father. Julian's hand stilled on her forehead. We haven't told them, Rachel said softly. Not officially. And we need to, soon, before someone else does it for us. Outside, the press was relentless. But inside, the house was now split in two, one half scrambling to maintain control, the other simply trying to survive. Julian watched Rachel closely, the woman he once lost, the mother of his children, lying exhausted from carrying more weight than anyone should. You know this won't last, she said suddenly, voice brittle. The novelty, the warmth, the bonding. You'll remember who you are, a billionaire, a public figure, and you'll realize, we don't fit. Julian shook his head. You're wrong. She looked away. They look like you, but they're mine too, raised by a secretary, not a socialite. When the press dies down, when things get complicated, you'll see us for what we are: embarrassment, chaos, risk. Julian gently took her hand, his voice steady and clear. I don't see a risk, Rachel. I see my sons, and I see the woman who raised them, strong, resilient, brilliant. You don't need to fit into my world. Because this, he looked toward the hallway where the boys were playing, this is the only world that matters now. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. She didn't answer, but for the first time in days, she let herself lean into his hand, and for a brief, fragile moment, they weren't at war with the past anymore. They were fighting for the same future, The DNA testing center was a sterile monument of glass and polished steel, clinical, cold, and far too impersonal for what it meant to Julian Westwood. He didn't need confirmation. Not really. Every glance from Elijah and Evan, every inflection in their voices, every shared gesture told him what he already knew in his bones. But the world outside was loud, judgmental, hungry for proof. And Julian was determined to protect his sons from doubt, from headlines that questioned their place in his life. The technician smiled gently as she leaned toward Elijah. "It's just a soft swab inside your cheek. No needles, I promise." Elijah sat up straight, stoic as ever, while Evan clutched Rachel's hand tightly from the next chair. Within minutes, the samples were collected from all three. "We'll have results in 48 hours, the technician assured. On the drive home, the car was unusually quiet. Julian watched them through the rearview mirror. "Is everything okay back there?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Then he spoke, voice small but serious. "What if the test says you're not our dad?" Julian's heart lurched. He looked back at their uncertain faces. "It won't," he said gently. "But even if it did, it wouldn't change anything. I still choose you, every day, no matter what." 2 days later, the email arrived. Julian opened the results in his study alone, hands trembling slightly as the digital document loaded. Paternity probability, 99.999997% confirmed. He stared at the words for a long time, exhaling a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. That evening, he gathered Rachel, Elijah, and Evan in the library. The atmosphere was quiet, serious, yet warm. Julian held the printed results in his hands and knelt in front of the boys. "I have something important to share with you," he said, his voice soft but steady. He showed the papers first to Rachel, who gave a small nod, eyes glistening with emotion. Then Julian looked to the twins. "Do you remember learning about DNA in school?" he asked. Evan perked up. "It's like the code inside us. It tells our bodies how to grow and who we are." "That's right," Julian smiled. "This paper says that my DNA and yours, it matches. That means I'm your biological father." The room fell silent. Elijah blinked. "That's why we all have the same eyes." Julian nodded. "And the same stubborn chin," he chuckled, pointing to Evan, who grinned shyly. There was a beat of silence. Then Evan's voice rose timidly. "So, can we call you Dad now?" Julian's throat tightened. He reached out and took their small hands in his. "I would be honored if you did." That night, as Julian stood outside their room, he heard a whisper from the darkness beyond the half-closed door. "Good night, Dad," Evan said. A pause, then Elijah's voice, quieter still. "Good night, Dad." Julian leaned his forehead gently against the doorframe, eyes brimming. He had missed first words, first steps, birthdays, and countless bedtime stories. But this first was a moment he would carry for the rest of his life. The house was too quiet. It was well past bedtime when Julian knocked softly on the boy's door, intending only to say goodnight. But as the door creaked open, he froze. The beds were empty, neatly made, too neat. On Elijah's pillow lay a folded sheet of lined paper, the words written carefully in a child's blocky handwriting. "We don't want to cause any more problems. Don't worry about us." "We went home." Julian's chest tightened as he read the note twice, then a third time, disbelief flooding his system. "Rachel," he shouted, already sprinting down the hall. Within seconds, Rachel appeared, robe clutched tightly around her frail frame. She read the note in silence, her lips trembling. "They wouldn't," she whispered. "They couldn't. They don't have money for a bus or cab," Julian said, already grabbing his coat. "Which means they're on foot." Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. "They've done this before. They know the way." Within minutes, the staff was mobilized. Julian's driver brought the car around while security fanned out across the neighborhood. Rain had started to fall in cold sheets, and streetlights cast lonely halos over the wet pavement. The first stop was Rachel's apartment building, dark, empty. Dusty blinds and silence confirmed what Julian already feared. They weren't there. Where would they go? He asked, desperate, scanning the nearby alleys and rooftops. Rachel's breath hitched, then her eyes widened. "The cemetery," she whispered. "My mother's grave. That's where they go when they're scared." Julian didn't hesitate. They drove like thunder, tires hissing against the rain-slick roads, every red light a torment. But when they reached the cemetery gates, there was nothing. No small shoes, no bundled coats, no boys huddled in the shadows. The cemetery was empty. and the search stretched into days. Police were notified. Missing child alerts were filed. Julian's contacts across the city mobilized. Pictures of Elijah and Evan appeared on local news and social media, their names whispered like prayers by strangers who'd never met them. Rachel barely slept, her health backsliding under the weight of stress. Julian canceled all business meetings, ignoring board demands and shareholder calls. Nothing mattered now except finding them. On the third morning, just as dawn painted the sky with pale gold, the mansion's doorbell rang. Alfred opened it to find a woman in her 30s, petite, with tired eyes but strong posture. She held the boy's hands tightly, one on each side. Elizabeth, Rachel gasped as she rushed to the door, tears flooding her face. You found them? Elijah and Evan ran into her arms, holding on with all the strength they had left. We were okay, Elijah murmured. She took care of us. Elizabeth Andrews had once been Rachel's assistant and the only friend who'd stayed through those difficult years. I didn't know what happened until I saw the news, she explained. They were at your mom's grave when I found them. They've been staying with me. Julian crouched beside the boys, soaking in the sight of them, tired but safe. Why did you run, Elijah? He asked gently. Elijah didn't meet his eyes. We heard the lawyers, he said, about the company, the problems, people saying we didn't belong. We didn't want to ruin your life. Rachel wiped tears from her cheeks as Evan added, we just wanted everything to go back to normal. Before the fighting, Julian reached out and wrapped them both in his arms. You didn't ruin anything. You saved me, he whispered. Elizabeth stepped forward, her expression now more serious. There's something else, she said, reaching into her bag. I've kept these for 7 years. She handed Julian a sealed envelope and a USB drive. Inside were copies of emails between Victor Langford and Westwood Realty's HR department. And most damning of all, a recorded audio file. Victor's voice, unmistakable and cold, threatening. Rachel into resignation. Take the settlement. Leave quietly. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to create misconduct allegations that'll stain you and him both. Julian stared at the file in stunned silence. This was it. The proof. The betrayal laid bare. And as he looked over at Rachel, her arms wrapped tightly around the boys, he realized this family had been robbed of 7 years, but now, they had the power to take it all back. The storm Victor Langford had unleashed was beginning to collapse, this time on him, armed with the evidence Elizabeth had provided: emails, recordings, and Rachel's original resignation letter. Julian's legal team moved like a quiet tidal wave. Swift, ruthless, precise. Charges were filed. Press conferences canceled, private meetings scheduled with the board. Inside the mahogany-walled chambers of Westwood Holdings, what had begun as a scandal targeting Julian was now a fire consuming Victor's legacy. The board listened in stunned silence as the recording played. Leave town, Rachel. Take the money. You say one word, and I will bury both your career and his. The silence afterward was total. By the time the lights came back on, the room had shifted. Executives who had once whispered doubts about Julian's judgment were now looking at Victor with visible disgust. Public apologies followed within days. The media pivoted, hungry for the redemption arc. Truth triumphs. Westwood family reunited after years of betrayal. From secret scandal to strength, Julian Westwood stand for his children, but none of that mattered. Not to Julian, not really, because the moment that did matter came in a quiet courtroom. Beneath warm light and polished wood, far from the cameras, Rachel stood beside Julian. The boys wore navy blue blazers and matching TIs. Elijah fidgeted, trying to look brave. Evan clutched his mother's hand. The judge, a kind-faced woman, looked over the documents and then at the family before her. Do you understand the meaning of this legal recognition? She asked softly. Julian knelt before the twins. It means, he said, eyes glistening, that no matter what anyone says, from this moment on, the world will know what we already feel. He looked at the judge and nodded. Yes, I do. She signed the papers with a firm hand and smiled. With this order, Elijah and Evan Carter are now legally recognized as Elijah Carter Westwood and Evan Carter Westwood, with Carter kept as their middle name, in honor of their mother. Rachel smiled gently. It's part of who they are. Outside, reporters waited, but this time, they didn't see a scandal, they saw a family. Julian placed a steadying hand on each boy's shoulder, Rachel on their other side. Cameras clicked as they walked down the courthouse steps, not as secrets, not as headlines, but as a father, a mother, and 2 sons, side by side, Later, in the car, Evan stared down at his new birth certificate, running his fingers across the ink like it was made of gold. Does this mean we're really Westwoods now? He asked. Julian smiled in the rearview mirror. You've always been Westwoods. This just makes it official. Rachel watched them with quiet pride. Boys who had once lived off scraps now beaming with the kind of certainty she'd prayed they'd one day feel. For years, she had fought alone. Now, she didn't have to. They were no longer surviving. They were a family recognized not just by law, but by love. 12 months had passed since the world learned the truth, but inside the Westwood estate, time hadn't just moved, it had bloomed. The once silent halls now echoed with laughter. Piano keys were pressed daily. Library shelves had fingerprints from curious little hands. The fridge was covered in star charts, stick figure comics, and spelling. Test results proudly held in place by gold magnets. Family photos now lined the hallway. Not the posed, stiff kind but real ones. Evan asleep on Julian's shoulder during story time. Elijah mid-laugh with Rachel in the garden. A messy chess match between father and son, frozen in a snapshot. Rachel, no longer just a guest in the mansion, now lived in the sunny guest house on the property close, but still independent. She had blossomed in her own way, taking charge of the newly launched Westwood Family Connection Foundation dedicated to helping single parents and children separated by deception or circumstance. Julian had never looked prouder than the day she stood behind a podium, speaking from experience with quiet fire in her voice. One crisp October evening, Julian stood in the foyer adjusting Evan's booty before the school's talent show. Nervous? He asked. Evan nodded. A little. What if I forget the words? Julian smiled. Then you'll find new ones. That's what writers do. In the auditorium, Julian and Rachel sat side by side, surrounded by families who once whispered behind their backs now offering nods, smiles, and warm waves. First up was Elijah, his fingers gliding confidently over piano keys as he played a classical piece Julian had taught him. The room fell silent as music filled the space, polished, beautiful, and full of quiet power. Julian sat forward, hands clasped, eyes misty. Then came Evan, holding a small paper in slightly shaking hands. He looked out into the crowd and took a breath. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's knocking on a door when you're starving, or opening your heart when it's been closed. Courage is building a family from broken pieces and finding home in unexpected places. The room was still when he finished, and then, applause. Full, thunderous, lasting applause. Rachel reached over and squeezed Julian's hand. After the show, the family stood outside under a clear night sky. Neighbors greeted them with warmth. Even the principal offered kind words. Dad, Elijah asked, tugging Julian's sleeve. Can we go somewhere special tomorrow? Julian smiled. Anywhere you want. To the cemetery, Evan said softly. We want to bring flowers. For Lena. Julian blinked, caught off guard. For Lena? Elijah nodded. Because, if she hadn't taught you how to love, you might never have found us. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with emotion. The next day, they stood at Lena's grave, a small bouquet of white lilies in Elijah's hands. The boys were quiet, respectful. Rachel stood a few feet back, letting them have the moment. Julian knelt, placing a hand on the smooth marble. They would have loved you, he whispered. And you would have loved them. He stood up, looked at his son's strong, bright, whole. The mansion wasn't just full again. It was alive. And in the most unexpected way, through heartbreak, lost years, and a knock at the door on a cold autumn evening. Julian Westwood had found the one thing wealth had never given him: family.